All right. So rather than calling this the third muscle length podcast, I want to call it the short position podcast. Because we talked, where everyone's talking about long muscle lengths. We've talked about long muscle lengths. We're not giving the short muscle lengths, a ton of love. And per our experience the other day, those kinds of things, and we'll get into that specific anecdote, always come up. And I always just remember why the short position training is important. I think for those kinds of reasons, like it's represented in like a small anecdote, like, oh, I did this today, and I was able to sort of train around this problem, kind of a thing. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to dedicate a podcast to talking about and answering the question, if I get more of a robust stimulus from like doing all these stretch position exercises and from making everything heavy in the stretch position, why would I bother doing the short position? If the response will not be as strong. And so I kind of want to start with just like, why would I, answer the question, why would I train the short position? And I think just before I hand it over to you, and kind of see where your head goes with it, I want to just briefly talk about, what a short position is, because I think that's something that a lot of people often blow past and don't really contextualize when they're talking about this in the first place. So if you think about muscle length on a spectrum of, the shortest possible length, the fully squeezed position of whatever that muscle is, we'll say, versus the longest possible length, right? You're just kind of, I think I've used this analogy before, but you're just kind of taking a string and you're pulling it as far apart as you can. And then, that would sort of represent inside of the body the most lengthened position, where you're just moving the attachment sites as far away from one another as they get, which in the context of a fan shaped muscle can be very different depending on which part of the fan shaped muscle you're talking about. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the position where the two bony attachments are moving as close to one another as possible. That's all that long and short muscle lengths are. And that specifically is in the context of talking about general anatomy, right? And so that is different from saying that an exercise is heavy in a more lengthened position, or short or lighter in a more lengthened position. So, for example, if we're talking about like, let's say a neutral triceps extension, like a rope triceps extension where your arms are at your sides and you're just doing a triceps extension that way, that would, be sort of one length of, we'll say, the long head of the triceps, which is the only one that crosses two joints. And then if you did the overhead version of that, where your arms were sort of back behind your head and you were doing extensions that way, you would be training a much longer length, specifically of the long head of the triceps. However, within the first option, within, we'll say, the triceps extension with your arms at your side, you have an opportunity to, make that exercise more difficult where the muscle is more lengthened within the context of that exercise. And you also have, an opportunity to, I don't know if I contextualize that. You have the opportunity to make an exercise heavy in the more lengthened position of the, we'll say, the rope extension, but you can also, let's say, step away from the cable machine and you can actually make it heavier in a more shortened position. So you can change the difficulty of, one muscle length scenario, i.e. the neutral extension, but then you can also sort of go over to the other exercise in the overhead extension, and you can actually change the muscle length itself. So there's these kind of two things that we have to juggle with this conversation. One is the actual muscle length and the anatomy on one side of things. And then the other is, hey, where is this exercise actually difficult? Where is there a lot of resistance? Because you can have resistance at a long length or a short length within the framework of one exercise. But that exercise may not be, under the category of this is a long position exercise or this is a short position exercise. So just to kind of wrap that up and to, say it a little bit differently and to clarify, you have these two sort of competing things, or not competing things, but these two things going on at once. One of which is, hey, how long is Ben's tricep just in and of his own anatomy? And then the other is, where is there a lot of resistance within this exercise? Because it may not actually be in the lengthened position, we'll say if you're doing a more stretched position exercise. So I don't know how well that was particularly explained, but if you have anything to add or clarify just about that general discussion, please add some input there.
Yeah, so first thing that comes to mind is like, what are some other words that we use to describe the short position? So we might say like, the flexed position, right? Or the contracted position, or, a lot of people know the terms concentric and eccentric. We may say it's like the fully, concentric position. Those are all different ways to describe what you might experience as short, so if someone were to pose a muscle, typically, they're going to pose it by bringing it into a relatively shorter position. Then from there, the two categories are really, muscles that, cross two joints and ones that don't, right? And I think that's a really important distinction is like, if, I take a quad muscle, for example, like the vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, that's not crossing the hip, and I want to, pose my quad muscles on stage, I'm simply just creating a force with the intention of extending my knee. So I'm not going to have a really bent knee when I'm trying to pose my quads. My knee is going to be, mostly straight, and I'm probably going to be pressing through the floor as if I was doing a leg extension. And that's going to allow those, muscles to, to get short and sort of present in a more contracted position. Then on the flip side of that, if I wanted to lengthen those muscles, I would go in the opposite direction and I would do something that looked more like a hamstring curl. So if I was on stage and I was doing a back pose, say rear double biceps, in that position, because you're not going to squat down on stage, your knee's mostly straight, but I have the intention of dragging my foot back against the floor as if I was doing a hamstring curl. And in that case, that's allowing me to more fully shorten my hamstring. However, I'm doing that from a position, like I mentioned, where my knee is mostly straight. So even from this position where I have, a more stretched hamstring, I'm able to, create force or have the intention, of doing knee flexion or doing a leg curl. So from the front, when I'm posing my quads, I'm in a shorter position with my quads. I'm contracting them just like I would at the top of a leg extension. But, when I'm doing a back double bicep and my leg is behind me and my knee is straight, I'm actually in a more lengthened position for the hamstrings, even though, I have the intention, of shortening them. So the same thing, kind of plays out here, in exercise. So for example, with the quads, the ones that I mentioned that don't cross the hip, when I get into a leg extension and I'm in a seated position so that my thigh is, closer to my chest than it would be if I was standing up, I can get those quad muscles that don't cross the hip into, or I can get all of those quad muscles into a fully shortened position. Now, on the flip side of that, we have a quad muscle that does cross the hip, the rectus femoris, and that also is going to get short when I'm in that seated position. But at the bottom of the leg extension, where I'm flexing my knee, or even at the bottom of the squat, I'm never able to fully lengthen that muscle because I'm never stretching it at both attachments. So because my hip is still closer to my chest and not behind me, like it would be, in the back double bicep, never fully lengthening that rectus femoris. Whereas if we were, say, doing like a split squat where I have one leg behind me on that back leg because it's now behind me, and as I come down and I'm bending my knee and my hip is behind me, I'm actually able to lengthen that rectus femoris the same way that I did with the hamstrings, when my leg was behind me and it was straight. So we have, some examples here of, like I said, muscles that cross one joint, muscles that cross two joints. And that's, I think, is the first part of the conversation, because if we have muscles that just cross one joint, and we're talking about short versus lengthen, I think it really just comes down to like, what position is that single joint in? So if I'm, like I mentioned, if I'm doing a leg extension, it's simply, for those muscles that don't cross the hip, what position is my knee in? But if we talk about the rectus femoris, or we're talking about hamstrings that cross the hip, for example, it's not just the position of the knee, it's also the position of the hip. So that's where you get into, with the hamstrings, for example, like a seated leg curl versus a lying leg curl. And like I mentioned with rectus femoris, the quad muscle, the leg extension versus, say, the split squat. I think once you have that distinction of the starting position in terms of like what's happening either at one joint or both joints that it crosses, I think then you layer on top of that where it's loaded.
Right.
And I think we've gone over this once before, but I think separating those two, like you mentioned, of like what's the initial starting position, and then from there, where is it loaded? So we can start in a position that's more stretched, either at like one single joint, how bent is my elbow versus how extended is my elbow, or we can stretch it even more, or shorten it even more by moving another joint that it crosses. So we have this full excursion of length in terms of like, a fully shortened position where both joints that it crosses allow it to be fully shortened, versus another position on the other side of the spectrum where both joints that it crosses allows it to be fully lengthened. And we could be anywhere in between on that spectrum. We could be anywhere from your arm being, towards an overhead position with your elbow flexed, to a position where your arm is moving behind you with your elbow fully extended. And anywhere along that spectrum, we could call, long to short. But then I think the point is, you could also, like you mentioned, be in a position where you're starting as lengthened as you could possibly be at, for a given muscle, but you could then have it loaded at its shortest position in that range, which is really important. So we could still set, say a seated hamstring curl, where you're starting off with a really lengthened, say biceps femoris, and so hamstring muscle, and we could have that seated leg extension be really hard in the fully contracted or short position, and have almost no load in the lengthened position. And then this whole idea of like lengthened versus shortened, becomes so much less relevant, because if you're in the position but you have no load there, it doesn't matter. It's kind of like bear shitting in the woods, or tree falls in the woods, and no one's around to hear it, see it, whatever. Like, did it really happen? So if you're in a lengthened position and there's no load there, doesn't matter. And I would say no. I think the whole deal here is the the direction and the magnitude of the loading in that position. So that was a long-winded way of saying exactly the same thing you said, but through a different lens.
No, I think that's part of why the back and forth is valuable, because we have sort of different ways to explain similar concepts, and we add different nuances, I think, as a consequence of that. I think one of the things that is, to your point, important to address is this single versus double, potentially triple joint difference. And I think an easy way for people to think about that, for any listeners who are not totally comfortable with terms like flexion, extension, and they don't have a clear image of what we're talking about, when in doubt, just do a quick Google of a muscle, right, or a group of muscles. Just look at their attachment points and then ask, okay, the farther I move, or rather, first ask, like, okay, how would this thing shorten? And the way that you answer that question is you look at the attachment points and you say, okay, if these two things just move closer together in a straight line, within the constraints of the body, how close can they move? And then, if you're looking to find the fully lengthened or stretched position, you ask how far away can they, how far away can they move? So just find the points, see, okay, where's the closest point, and then where's the farthest point, and then everything sort of in between those is the sort of spectrum of length that we can talk about. And obviously, that being a sort of generalized recommendation, is sometimes it's difficult to picture that or to describe that with, certain muscles. Like if you're talking about the quads, you're talking about your knees bending. It's not like you're picturing the attachments just moving in a straight line away from, each other. It's like they're sort of wrapping around a bone, right? So there are things like that. But I think that in terms of the single versus double joint conversation, the reason that the 2-joint, 3-joint muscles do have the capacity to be a bigger part of this conversation is because they just have the potential to be at extremes that single joint muscles do not. So the double joint quad that you mentioned, the rec fem, the reason that it's more relevant to consider in the context of this conversation is because it can be physiologically so much shorter, and it can also be physiologically so much longer than the other quads, simply because it has the capacity to wrap and lengthen around 2 joints as opposed to 1 joint. Hamstrings are another good example of this. 3 of the 4 hamstrings cross the hip, and the one that doesn't cross the hip just crosses the knee. So the one that crosses the knee only has the opportunity to lengthen when the knee moves, but the other ones have an opportunity to lengthen when the knee moves and also when the hip moves. So whenever you're feeling like a significant stretch in any muscle, it's probably only happening through, muscles that cross 2 joints. And just as an interesting maybe side note to this, you could make the argument that like your lats and your pecs are not single joint tissues, right? They don't act on 1 joint. They don't just act on the shoulder, they act on the whole shoulder complex. And so you could argue they're not single joint muscles, but they will effectively like lengthen and shorten, kind of like single joint muscles do in terms of like sensation. Most of the time, like we don't feel the same degree of stretch on those fan shaped muscles. And that's sort of more of a feature and not a bug, right? Because the purpose of a fan shaped muscle, at least evolutionarily, is to distribute force over a large surface area. And so, when you're talking about a muscle like a hamstrings, it's not like, you have many options to powerfully bend your knee other than, your hamstrings, right? You have some accessory knee flexors, right? But the hamstrings are like the main guys doing that, right? When you're talking about something like a pec, and you're talking about its mechanics, not only does it have a really good ability to sort of distribute force so you don't feel as focal attention on one portion of the pec, at least usually, but you also don't have an opportunity to lengthen it as much because it kind of functions like a single joint muscle, at least in terms of its length change and those kinds of things. So I think overall, we circle back to, okay, single joint muscles versus 2 joint muscles. Now let's start to talk about some examples of like layering the profile stuff that we were mentioning on top of that. So I think it's important to start from where you ended, which was, if we don't talk about resistance and direction of resistance, then this whole conversation in some ways becomes moot. So I would like to go back to the beginning of this podcast when I mentioned the anecdote with you and talk a little bit about that first. So you were doing a triceps extension, and in previous weeks that fully bent elbow position has been, at least just for 1 week, not 100% comfortable for you. So what we chose to do was we chose to make the resistance of a higher, degree of torque in the fully elbow straightened position. So if you're thinking about forget the whole shoulder thing for now. If you're picturing a triceps extension, you have where your elbow is straight and then you have where your elbow is bent. And when we're saying higher torque at the fully straightened position, that's also another way to say we're making it heavier in the short position. And so when we did that for you, and then you sort of went back to the scenario where you were loading proportionately more of the elbow bent position, the more stretched position, that tended to feel, at least as far as I understand, a little bit better, a little bit smoother than it did initially. And there are obviously multiple things involved with that, but I think that's maybe a useful anecdote to start with, just in terms of addressing now this conversation between resistance differences, because in either case, and I'll hand it off to you in a second, you didn't change the actual physiological length of any of the muscles between the variants necessarily. You kind of were just doing a normal tricep extension with your arm out to the side. And all we did was we just sort of turned your body relative to the cable. So that's an example where it's like we really had the same muscle length. But if you were to measure the response that you would get between those two exercises and just a 1-to-1, dose response, however we could most practically manage that in a study, you would probably see a more robust response from the variation where you were loaded more in the elbow bent position, as opposed to the elbow straightened position, i.e. the lengthened position versus the short position of that particular exercise, right? And then we can sort of maybe talk about changing your shoulder position and what that might do next. But I think an important place to start the short conversation is, well, we can talk about hypertrophy all we want, and we could label this whole conversation as like, oh, this is just the nuanced 0.00001% of gains here. But if you're looking at the only outcome that matters as hypertrophy and muscle size, then you're missing the whole discussion about what actually allows for muscle growth long term, which is health of your joints. So I kind of like to think about joint health as the precondition for muscle growth, where the health of the joints, and health is obviously somewhat of a vague term that I think we could very esoterically start to define, like, well, like what is health? It's like, really in this context, it's like, do your joints like hurt, short, medium, and long term? And we obviously don't want them to hurt on any of those timelines. And it would be best if they could never hurt. And that's what we might call, optimal joint health or whatever. So joint health kind of being this precondition for muscle growth. How do you think that, short positions sort of fit into that framework in terms of, your general thoughts on that conversation? But then also, like, do you find yourself now intentionally, adding more volume into certain exercises at certain lengths for the sake of that sort of longevity piece? Because I kind of want to turn the conversation in that direction of like, well, why would we actually, want to do the short stuff?
Yeah. One thing I think we should put a pin in and come back to is how do you set up an exercise to be most difficult in the short position? So we're saying things like, oh, there's more torque here when we set up the cable this way. And that's one of those things for us that we've just done so many times that we might skip over and not explain. And it can be hard in some ways on a podcast to describe that setup. But I think when we talk about like, the cable being, sort of 90 degrees, to the axis or to, the, to the joint that we're trying to load, if we can put that sort of in context, for the listeners and sort of use words that will hopefully allow them to picture what we're talking about when we say loading a joint short, and maybe talking about some machines that might already do that in most cases, just based on the way they're typically set up. I think that might be a useful conversation to come back to once we've defined like why it's important.
Yeah. I'll write that down. That's a good idea.
So the context of like why it's important, I think it's relevant to just say off the bat, like there is not a lot of direct, maybe no direct research really supporting the idea that like short positions, at least that I'm aware of, that short positions is better for long-term orthopedic health, and just direct studies investigating what we're talking about. But I think there is a lot of anecdote, and when you just sort of look historically on where bodybuilders trend sort of over their careers, what people do in terms of warming up, where most rehab exercises are oriented, I think you see a trend. And I think if people are willing to like experiment and not come in with a bias, they'll see that it shows up in a lot of places. And it does, seem to, at least anecdotally, have a lot of benefit. So just thinking off the cuff, like where do we see this show up a lot and what might be some confounders with that? I think when you look at like the exercise selection of more advanced bodybuilders, just as they get, further on in their career and they've, incurred more joint stresses, or also as they get further on in their career and they become stronger and stronger, you start to see their exercise order change. It's very common to see bodybuilders, say on a leg day, do something like hamstring curls, maybe even leg extensions, maybe even abduction, adduction. Like they often do, some single joint, or isolation movements before they move into, the compound or multi-joint lifts. And, most machines loading those exercises are often difficult in the short position, whether they know it or not. They're often, getting into a fairly short position for that muscle with, say, like a lying hamstring curl or a leg extension. And very many times, relative to their output, the machine is still difficult short. Like even if you have a machine that has the intention of being heavier long, uh, looking at where people fail, oftentimes it's still in a relative sense pretty difficult in the short position. And you'll also see people do things like, pause. I just tried to do a leg extension and kick my dog's food. I don't know if you heard the bowl.
It was weird. It sounded like there was a glitch at your voice. Like the sounds kind of blended together, and you sounded robotic for a second.
It didn't fall over anything.
Okay, yeah, continue.
Um, so as far as like, warming up goes, it might be, a leg extension, it might be like a cable fly. These are things that you very commonly see. And usually what people say is, I just want to get some blood in the muscle. That's the thing that I hear like the most common, like just, verbal description of this is just like, I'm just trying to get some blood in the muscle,
Mhm.
get the,
You know what I think is a better alternative, like a more technically accurate alternative that no one would ever say is something along the lines of like, I just want to shift the synovial fluid, like that's ultimately what I think people are saying. But yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, even before leg extensions, a lot of times people do leg curls. A lot of times before pressing, they'll do pulling. It's kind of a separate conversation there, but there is something. My point is, there's something to the order of exercises that you choose, and there's something to a contracted, sort of squeezed position before things that are very difficult in a stretch position. And I think people picked up on this anecdotally. I think in rehab, you see almost exclusively uh, exercises that are sort of early stage exercises in rehab, where people are holding, squeezing very often in contracted positions, whether that be from like a learning perspective in terms of like feeling the position they're in from a sensory standpoint, whether that just be from a practical perspective, because many times, rehab's not using machines, but they're using like body weight or bands and things like that. Whether that be from a total like progressing output standpoint, where maybe you just can't get as much output in a short position as you could if you were to be able to load it in a way where it was hardest where you were strongest in the lengthened position. Whatever it is, I think, we'll know more and more with time as more research comes out and more people focus on this concept. But I think at the end of the day, when you're making decisions about your training, you don't always need to know the exact mechanisms of why something is what it is. And you certainly don't want to experiment for a decade and find out you made the wrong decision. You can look to people that have ran those experiments, watch sort of where they end up in their own experience. And I think that's a pretty safe way to go. In fact, I think many times I would, go with that over the research, because a lot of times the research is just proving why people decide to do that. So if you see in general these just like large trends of where, successful people are doing a given thing, I think it's reasonable to kind of, hop on that bandwagon and figure out why later. So I think that gives a little bit of context to just like where I see this, in common practice. In terms of like how it plays out in my training, I start with the concept generally of I'm trying to set up an exercise to be, hardest where I'm strongest and easiest where I'm weakest. That's always like my starting concept is like that's kind of my ideal is just be able to get the most total output and sort of be as efficient as I can in terms of getting the most out of every rep.
Yeah, so let's integrate this with what we were talking about earlier because it'll be a good place to do it. So in the context of what you just described with a cable setup, let's say you're doing a single arm triceps extension, where that would be visually the heaviest, if people can picture this, is where the cable is 90 degrees from your forearm. That would be the heaviest position that you are facing. We don't have to get into the technical reasons why that would be the case. But basically, and this is a good rule for all cable exercises, it's easiest to see probably with biceps and tricep stuff, but whenever the cable is 90 degrees from the moving segment, that is where it is heaviest relative to the rest of the range. And whenever you're moving either away from 90 in the higher or lower direction, you are moving into a lighter position. So if you set up a cable extension and your arm was, fully, and your elbow is fully flexed, for anyone watching, they can see my elbow flexed, you would need to angle the cable sort of backward, behind your head or in some direction, right, to make it 90 degrees in that position. But if you were to fully straighten your elbow and make it heaviest there, then all of a sudden it's like, you're doing a you're doing a shoulder exercise, you're doing a rear delt thing as opposed to a triceps thing. So that's where we introduce something like an anchor when we want to make it heavier short. But we can talk about that a little bit later. So just to give people a picture, like when we're talking about this specific example, cable 90 degrees from the forearm, that's where it's heaviest. And then it's lighter when that cable moves away from the forearm segment at around 90.
Let's give some like common examples of things that people do all the time and like where they're difficult. So, for example, like with a biceps curl, if I'm using a cable, and we'll use the cable as kind of the primary example here because it's, you talked about having the cable 90 degrees from the forearm, and we can see that play out, in biceps and triceps exercises pretty easily. And then from there, maybe we could talk about, where sort of free weights come in, machines and whatnot. So some common exercises, like if I was doing a cable curl and I was facing the machine, and let's say I'm really close to the machine, it's going to very much resemble a dumbbell curl in this case. Would you agree with that in terms of like where it's difficult?
Yeah, if you're like in line with the pulleys, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm facing the machine, cables are down by my feet. I do a curl, and the place where the cable is going to be 90 degrees to my forearm is in the middle of the exercise. So when my elbow isn't fully flexed and isn't fully extended, somewhere in the middle of that exercise, the cable is going to be about 90 degrees. And much like using a dumbbell, the resistance is going to be, most difficult, or in other words, most torque, in that middle position. Now, if I back up, the further, I'm still facing the cables, still facing the machine. The more and more that I back away from the machine, the harder and harder it's going to get in the fully shortened position, fully contracted, fully elbow bent position there. And Ben, I know a moment ago you sort of added that component of, well, not only is it going to be harder in the short position bicep wise, but now we also have to deal with what is it doing at another joint, and how do we deal with like how it's pulling on the shoulder. So same thing when we flip around, I flip around, and by what I mean by the same thing is we also have to deal with how it's pulling on the shoulder, and that's kind of where the anchor comes in. But when you flip around and now you're facing away from the machine, as I move further and further, away from the machine, it's going to get harder in the lengthened position. And now there probably is a point, Ben, in which that, kind of changes and you're dealing with, you know, uh, there is sort of an optimal point, I guess, that I can walk away from the machine and have that, be loaded lengthen. But basically, if I face away from the machine, I walk away from it a little bit, I can set it up so the cable's 90 degrees from my forearm when my elbow is fully straight. Do you have anything to add to that example there?
Yeah, I would just say, and this is kind of like proof in the pudding for for why the anchoring concept is so important, is that a lot of people, when they do the face away curl, they'll step like pretty far away from the cable stack. And one of two things will happen. If the person keeps their arms like rigidly in line with their body so that the cable does end up being farthest from their elbow in the bottom or heaviest in the bottom, then it just ends up feeling like a shoulder thing, and you see people just moving their shoulder forward to move the weight forward. And if they don't rigidly keep their arms in line with their body and they do let their whole arm get pulled backward, well, then from a relative standpoint, now the loading is just heavier, in the middle of the range, like it would be with a dumbbell curl. So if you don't have something to stop your shoulder from moving backward, or we'll say in this case, if you don't have something to stop your shoulder in either extreme position, meaning fully shortened position or fully lengthened position, then you're gonna miss out on a lot of the potential output that you could create, as compared to if you just sort of struck the middle. So I think with this short long stuff, the anchoring stuff becomes more and more important as you move toward either extreme, fully lengthened or fully shortened, at least in this context. And the same thing kind of, no, not with triceps, it's a little bit different depending on the variation. But I think that's a good point to make, which is that you can't just look at the elbow in the same way that you can't just look at the knee in the context of hamstrings training, quad training, and biceps triceps training, when it comes to like curls and extensions and stuff. So I think that's a good point to make. I don't really know if I would have anything else to add there other than maybe just maybe giving like some free weight equivalents. So for the biceps stuff, we could look towards something like a preacher curl, where maybe your arm is kind of relatively in front of your body. Depending on the angle, of course, it could change, and depending on the angle of the preacher that you set, where it's heavy could change. But I think that's a good picture for people to have, just in terms of continuing this conversation around length change and stuff. And then on the flip side, you could have something like, an incline curl where you incline a bench back or around like 60 degrees or something like that, and your arms are kind of behind your body. But obviously the resistance in that case is kind of, the same as just a standing curl, right? If your arm is 90 degrees from the floor. So, when we're looking at free weight stuff, the same concept of, longer distance equals higher torque equals higher experience of resistance. Dumbbells can only really be heavy. And this is a good rule of thumb, I think, for biceps triceps training. Dumbbells are the heaviest when your forearm is parallel to the floor. So, and we're in relationship to the elbow forces. So, that's why, and there have been, I think at least one study that has concluded this, but it was the comparison between the preacher curl and the incline curl, where people could see the consequence of having resistance with a shorter position exercise versus not having as much resistance with the lengthened position exercise. You saw in that one-to-one comparison where with the preacher curl outperformed the incline curl, despite the fact that the incline curl was at a longer muscle length. And so to our conversation around resistance direction, that's where I think this ultimately comes back to in some ways, which is you need to have the conversation in tandem. You can't have it as you can't talk about it as if there are two completely separate things. In terms of the whole stretch mediated concept of getting more out of length and position exercise, it's like only in the context of exercises that are actually loaded there. So did you have anything to add there?
I think so. Like more examples I could think of would be like sort of a front double bicep position curl. I think people call it like a crucifix curl, you
Yeah.
know, in really just about every practical case, that's going to be hardest in the short position. Because if you picture where the cables would need to be coming from in order for it to be hard lengthened, basically need to be on the floor,
Mhm.
which never really allow you to get fully short. So if you see like, someone doing that front double bicep curl, that's going to be a short position. When you see people doing flies, on a similar type cable setup where you're in the cable rack that's like really really wide, and you're stepping forward. You basically have to walk to one side of the cable to grab a handle, walk to the other side, um, and you do flies in there. That's going to be particularly heavy in the short position, versus if we were doing say a dumbbell fly, uh, laying on a bench like Ben mentioned, when your arms parallel to the floor. That's where it's going to be the most difficult. So you really have two ends of the spectrum. A lot of people will say like, oh, a fly is really good exercise to like train the pecs, in a short position, or maybe they may say it's a really good exercise to stretch the pecs, and in both cases, there's, kind of some missing nuance there, right? Because in the case, of let's say the dumbbell fly, there's really no resistance, as far as the resistance direction goes in the short position. Whereas the cable fly, there's a ton of resistance, in the short position relative to the lengthened position, especially when those cables, are really far apart. And then when it comes to say, oh, it's a really good lengthened position exercise, really good stretch exercise, they're really not talking about the joint position so much. They are talking specifically about this like resistance direction and about the torque that you're experiencing. So even though in the dumbbell fly, you're not in the most lengthened position you could be for the pec, there's a ton of resistance there relative to the short position. So it's a really good example of like where the exercise is heavy, it really changes the experience. So you experience that stretch, you experience that length and challenge on the dumbbell fly, and you may call that, a stretching exercise.
Mhm.
Where, the cable one, you may think of that as, more of a, pump, more of a shortening, more of a contraction exercise, simply because of where you experience the, resistance between the two of those examples.
Mhm. Yeah, and to kind of circle, full circle this, like to maybe more directly answer what, now that we have a lot of context of like, okay, why would we choose the short position thing? Well, a couple main reasons. So the first would be that if you look at just if we were to be able to take the examples that you just discussed, perfect example, like cable fly, where it's heaviest when your arms are kind of, closest together, where your hands are kind of touching, versus dumbbell fly, where your arms are only really loaded in the bottom. Those are two good examples of like, okay, one is loaded, in the stretch, and one is loaded in the in the short position, and effectively they're very similar motion. So like, which would you see a better outcome from in terms of hypertrophy? Well, you probably see a better outcome from the dumbbell fly if you had to take a best guess. And the reason that you would probably see that outcome is simply because it would be just a higher, and give me pushback on this if you think there's more, there should be pushback on this. I just look at it as like, one is just higher force and the other is just lower force, lower magnitude. And there are a couple of reasons for that, all of which are sort of overlapping. But to go back to square one here to talk about muscles for a second, when we go back to that example of, okay, you have these 2 points of attachment and you move them as far away from one another as possible versus when they're as close to one another as possible. Much like with a rubber band, the more that you stretch the rubber band, right, the more tension that is generated. And when it comes to muscle stuff and muscle physiology, the reason for that is because there are a lot more potentially passive elements that are involved in the contraction of a longer length, and there are not as many in the contraction of a shorter muscle length, right? So I just think of it like stretch positions, and when you have load there, they're just higher force versus short position stuff. But the trade-off of that is the fact that they're higher force, right? So higher force, potentially more robust stimulus, potentially also higher joint reaction forces, right? And so we can't just outright say that we would always do the stretch position thing, well, because that doesn't take into consideration what the potentially longer term impacts of consistently hitting that bigger button might actually be. And so that's where maybe, doing one session of the dumbbell fly and one session of the cable fly may come into use. Is you're still training the quality of contraction that you want, but you're doing it in a way that is differentiated in some regards, right? Because technically, and we haven't touched on this, it could be a more specific, stimulus. For example, like all the pecs really function well together when the arm is sort of behind the body, but when the arm is in front of the body, the pecs, differentiate in their function. So you could make the argument that the fly is more specific to one portion of the pec, and in the case of cables, but in the case of dumbbells, you have more of the total pec involved, right? Which obviously is intertwined with the whole force equation thing of just there being more total tension. It's all of these things are sort of occurring at the same time and overlapping. And if you just blindly conclude that, oh, the dumbbell fly is higher force where I'm stronger, and so I can use more weight, I get a stronger stimulus, and I do that twice a week for whatever amount of time, you may eventually run into a situation where not only are those same patterns and tissues, both contractile and connective, getting stressed in the same exact way over and over and over again, but you just may eventually run into a sort of roadblock of this thing of, quote, joint health, that may limit your ability to continue to add load or just recover from a connective tissue standpoint. And that's where I would say do one of the cable fly and do one of the dumbbell fly, because again, you're training similar qualities, but you're also training different qualities or different enough qualities for you to maybe sustain longer progression runways, and as a consequence, longer term, outcomes potentially, both in terms of maintaining joint health and hypertrophy as a consequence of that. What did I sort of miss there in terms of that comparison?
No, that all sounded good. I was kind of thinking back to, sometimes we take tangents, where I take tangents with conversations where I was answering one question, I totally forgot where I was going initially. And I started to say, like, how do I actually use this, in practice? And one of the things I said is, well, I start with the concept of let me load an exercise to be hardest where I'm strongest and easiest where I'm weakest. So that's kind of my starting place. If I have one, exercise, for a given pattern position, that I'm trying to train, that's going to be my default. But that doesn't mean that that's always the case and that's the only consideration. That's just kind of the starting place. It's like, what tissue am I trying to train? What position do I want to train that tissue from? And then if I'm going to load it in just one way, I want to load it, to get the most output, per single rep. But then from there, it can get really nuanced. For one, sort of slightly tangential to this, it might be like, how do I want to, like, which joint do I really want to, like, put the load directly on in order to load that muscle? So, for example, with like the pec fly, I could put the implement in my hand, but there are also pec flies where I could load it, instead at the elbow, and that may change the stress on the wrist, that may change the stress on the elbow, that may even change the stress on the shoulder. So as a starting place, I'm thinking about, like, which joint do I, want to specifically load, and what distance, from that joint do I want to load it? There's the order of the exercises plays into that as well. If I'm looking to train a specific muscle, let's stick with the pecs for this example. If I did, say, a pec fly before a press, I would inevitably end up using less load on the press. And for me, the way that I think about that is, I don't think I get less pec by using less load doing the press afterwards, but I do think there's potential to maybe get less other stuff. So I just kind of, I decide what is it that I want to fail? What is it that I want to be the limiter? And in this case, if I want the pec to be the limiter and I do, pec flies first and then go into chest press, my thought is that assuming that the chest press is set up well to train the fibers I'm looking to train, that doing the fly first will, decrease the load, but that the pecs will likely still be, the rate limiter to that chest press, and thus using less load isn't necessarily going to decrease the stimulus I'm getting to the pecs, even though it may play into the stimulus that I get at, say, the front delt or the tricep. So if decidedly I'm going for pecs, and let's say, in this example, like the elbows, have been a little bit tweaky, it might be good to say start with a fly that is, a pec deck loaded at the elbow, so I can sort of take the elbow out of the equation there, and then go into a press afterwards. And then I also have this decision of like, as we've been talking about, where do I want to make it difficult? Again, if I'm starting with the pec fly, I'm still going to start with the concept of like, can I load it in a way that's most efficient per rep? And now I might have a machine that I can use where it's lined up very well in the sense that it's heavy where I'm strongest, in a more lengthened position, and drops off as I move into the short. But most machines that you come across and most ways that people set things up don't allow you, to do that in sort of a quote unquote optimal way that really lines up well with that. So in many cases, what we'll do with, like, let's take a row, for example, is even if that row is, dropping off in the short position, it might not drop off enough. So many times what I'll do is, maybe train the full range of motion for, 2/3 of the set, 3/4 of the set. I'm doing, 3 sets, maybe 2 of them are full range of motion, so to speak, or 3 out of 4 sets are full range of motion. Maybe on that last set, I'll just do the length and range, so that I'm not sort of pre-fatiguing myself by like going through the full range of motion when I could be getting, more output just by doing the length in itself. So in most cases at this point, I have machines and setups for exercises that don't make that necessary, where just the rep is loaded, in places where I want it to be, heaviest and lightest. But in cases where I'm maybe in a different gym or that's, not possible, I may split it up into 2 separate components. And I do tend to start, or I always start with, either it being specifically hard in the short position, or just that I'm doing the entire rep so that I'm getting into the short position before I then move to using more load or the same load for more reps by just doing that lengthened position, exercise, like just doing partial reps in a more stretched position. The other way that I might use it is for myself at this point, like I'm still making progress, I've been able to make progress recently just training each muscle group primarily once per week. And I think that's just based on, one, just the total amount of output that I'm able to get, per exercise, per session, and kind of like, what that does as a consequence joint wise, I think just takes, a little bit longer to recover from that than someone who, potentially wasn't as strong. So I think, you see also in powerlifting, basically the more they can lift, typically the less, frequency they're lifting at over a career, just as a general trend. So same thing for me. I found I can still make progress training once muscle group on average once per week. And that, tends to be very sustainable from a joint health perspective. And I still see progress as far as my loads going up, still see progress as far as body composition. But, if I did want to prioritize a muscle group more, say, for example, right now I'm doing middle delts, a couple times a week. On the second day that I train them, I'm doing more of a short position exercise. And I'll do this a little bit with biceps and triceps as well at times. So one day, the exercises are loaded where it's, say I'm using a cable and I'm doing, a lateral raise. And again, it's set up so at the bottom of the lateral raise where I'm facing away from the stack, the cable's 90 degrees from my forearm. And then on the second day, I'm doing them using a lateral raise machine. Again, that concept comes back where now I'm not loading it at the wrist anymore. I'm loading it closer to the shoulder. And on the lateral raise machine, there's a pad that's just above my elbow. And that machine happens to be pretty difficult in the short position. And I'll kind of pause there for a second. And I actually do more sets of that exercise as well. And it just kind of takes short rest periods and just let the fatigue sort of mount, and let that take me to failure versus just getting like a ton of output, in each individual rep and each individual set. I would imagine, there is, sort of a point where the two cross in terms of number of sets, where you could say, all right, if I did a lengthened exercise for X amount of sets, it takes this many sets of a shortened exercise, to get a similar stimulus. And we don't know if that's, 50% more, 100% more, but it's likely, a little bit more. So those are some ways, that I sort of incorporate this concept of, lengthened versus shortened, and, where things are heavy, and, which joint, I'm choosing to load it from.
Yeah, and I also find this conversation very interesting because, in studies that appear to have direct one-to-one comparisons, you can never make two different force scenarios a one-to-one comparison. In the obvious sense of like, well, we're using a different part of the range, and so there may be just different loading as a consequence of our relative strength. But let's say even in the context of something like a leg extension, if you're accounting, even if you do, if we do make our best guess about, this many sets of the top half may equal this many sets of the bottom half, and whatnot. Even in the case where, let's imagine that we could use the same load in the top as we do in the bottom, right? Which obviously we can't. The demand on stability is much higher in the short position as in the lengthened position. So I also wonder, like, even if we could use the same load, are we getting fewer reps because we're that much weaker from a muscular standpoint? Or in all of these studies, do people just have a much more difficult time managing the stability challenge at the top, where there's a longer distance to it pulling you out of the seat as compared to the bottom half? Like that's another huge factor. So I do wonder, like, if we really paid attention to those kinds of things, like the anchoring, concept, like, would this be as drastic of a difference, compared to what we're currently seeing in some of these studies? And I tend to think we would see a much more similar outcome if we were able to kind of equate for those kinds of stability challenges, which, even if you're someone who really knows what they're doing, it's not always the easiest thing to do and to figure out, if you're not someone who has a lot of experience with it. Even if you're vaguely aware that, like, yeah, I need to sort of pull harder on the handles in the top of the leg extension compared to the bottom, that can be a challenge. So overall, I think some important takeaways are short position training can be useful for accumulating, volume in a way that is useful and contributes to the outcome, but that isn't as stressful, medium to long term, right? I mean, even acutely. If you have a muscle specific goal, I mentioned earlier briefly the differences between, the cable fly and the dumbbell fly, and how the cable fly could be more specific, right? In the case of the fan shaped tissues, you can always be more specific with the short position exercises, right? Because, for example, the upper and the lower pecs will act together, at the bottom of a press to move the arm forward. But when the arm moves in front of the body, they now are pulling pretty much in two very different directions. So you can be more differentiated, when you're training short position stuff with fan shaped muscles. Again, you can potentially accumulate more quality volume. We also have to remember that the short positions for the shortest positions for one tissue, are also the more stretched positions for other tissues. And so it's useful to, across the board, make sure that you're training at some point, I think, the full length of contraction, just because, all muscles are stabilizers, and regardless of which position we're looking at, they're always sort of playing a role. So it's good to have, contraction competency in all different kinds of positions. And then, if you're someone who plays a sport, and you are looking to, potentially improve the quality of contraction in a very specific position for that sport, this is another way that that becomes relevant. And in the context of, an athlete who is involved in games several times a week, the short position stuff I think becomes more and more important because you're able to maintain some degree of that quality while still incurring the stresses of the sport. Whereas doing, super heavy length and position stuff may not be something that's practical from a recovery standpoint. So a lot of different reasons to do the short stuff. And yeah, I think that overall a good analogy, this is an analogy I just thought of, although I'm sure many people have used a similar analogy before. I think using car analogies are fun. And in the context of like a road trip, I think you can look at the, short position variant as like you sort of driving a responsible speed. Let's say you're driving on a 65, maybe you drive 70. You're still progressing at a rate that is reasonable, but that also is not likely to get you pulled over. But you could also drive, 80 or 90 miles an hour, and you may get to your destination faster, but you also run the risk of potentially getting pulled over more frequently. And as a consequence of that, you may actually get to your destination at a much slower rate, turtle and hare sort of situation. So the slower you move, the less potential risk I think that you likely have. But I think we should also contextualize that and say that this conversation applies, I think, to a very specific category of person, meaning that if you are doing mostly lengthened position exercises, but if you're not putting a ton of effort into those exercises, then this conversation in some ways is kind of moot as a concept and maybe better left to a later point where you are at a point where you need to start to really worry about just these more potentially minor things after you've sort of have the effort box and the all the other relevant boxes checked. So I think that's a good place to wrap it up, unless you have any sort of final thoughts, things that maybe we didn't mention. I thought that was pretty holistic overall.
I think as an idea for a future study, I'd love to see this concept examined under the context of like equating force. So you mentioned like the leg extension, for example. If we used like an isokinetic dynamometer, a research tool, that's moving at a consistent speed, or we use it just sort of as an isometric, but we can control for muscle length, but then we could also in a machine like that measure force, sort of area under the curve for force over time. So say like impulse. And we could equate those two things. I would love to see, force equated between like a short position and a more lengthened position, even at a single joint. So say that leg extension at the top, either just controlled at a given fixed speed or in an isometric hold, where instead of having it equated by training to failure, which is a very like real world example, and I think very practical and very useful. I think, to get to the bottom of the mechanisms, it would be really interesting just to equate force. So instead of like having it being a typical example of how people actually train in the gym, we look at it from a more mechanistic explanation and see like, well, if you completely equate force, under the curve as far as time goes, does it make a difference? Like, is it that you're loading the lengthened position, or is it simply just what you're able to do in the lengthened position? And, of course, we don't know the answer to that, but I think it would be very interesting to see, because then from there you could say, well, if it's, really just driven by force, then it's these other things that we really need to pay attention to. It's this, stability and anchoring concept we need to pay attention to. It's like all it ends up becoming at that point is just a total like, volume and loading equation, just to, and then like many other things, it becomes less about this really one unique variable, and it becomes much more just like a total picture and total sort of just weighting one option versus another option. Because currently we're seeing it as this distinct thing. versus just like a total trade-off across the continuum. And it may very well be this distinct thing that's driven by, all these distinct mechanisms, or maybe all these distinct mechanisms are just, equating to a much larger concept. And I think that would be one really interesting way to look at it. And, if there's people leave comments somewhere in the YouTube, channel, whatever, maybe we can sort of delve into like what would be some interesting ways to explore that in the research, and pass it on to people that we know doing research. But I think right now, for practicality's sake, I'm glad that it started the way it did, with sort of like real world type scenarios. But that also lends people to beliefs about why it's relevant that may or may not be productive in terms of how they conceptualize their training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really well said. And just to give one last example of maybe like a variation of something I said earlier about the leg extension, and something that you sort of alluded to just now, there's one study that made a comparison between triceps extensions in the overhead position versus in a neutral or anatomical position. And the outcome was like highly in favor of the overhead extension. And a very good reason as to why that might be, other than just length of the muscle, is the fact that the force direction is so much easier to stabilize and manage in the overhead position, which is counterintuitive to a lot of people, because a lot of people are like, wait, overhead, that's kind of like a harder position to manage. But if you look at the way they did it, I'm pretty sure they literally had like a machine that was like or there was some method that they used of standardization that was like they were basically anchored in the overhead position, and even if they weren't anchored, the load direction, if it were parallel to the bone, would be very easy to deal with. Whereas if you do a triceps extension with your arm at your side, you have this whole shoulder management force that becomes much more difficult. So and even in the context of triceps, it's like the length change is significant, but it's not that significant like in the long head of the triceps, just based on fiber direction relative to the joint structure and the bones. You'll get some length change around the shoulder, but it's not a large enough amount to warrant, in my estimation, that significant of a difference in outcome. I think the bigger factor there is just how easy are what are calling the secondary forces, how easy are they to manage? And as a consequence, what happens to the output via that instability or stability?
And where I thought you were going with that actually is from memory, the other heads of the triceps also grew more.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's really the interesting thing, is like, if the hypothesis was that the long head will grow more, because it's in a more lengthened position, we actually saw that the other heads of the tricep
Yeah.
as well. So I think that really too.
Yeah. And then of course, if you don't just look at the fundamentals of like the force stuff, we go down these weird rabbit holes of like, well, is it the effect of blood moving, which reasonably is like that's a creative thing, but it feels like it wouldn't be that significant. Like if that were the case, then we could just fucking occlude everything on our body and just like we would see higher outputs or higher dose responses that way.
Yeah, you don't see. It's not like when going to failure. It's not like we see more muscle growth by occluding.
Yeah,
you just get there faster with less load.
Yeah. But I do think that it is helpful from a content creation perspective for people to be like, oh, it could be this thing, it could be this thing, rather than just being like, no, it's just like a lot easier to it's just a lot easier to deal with from a force perspective. So when in doubt, look at the force directions. You got your answers, and at the end of the day, if you don't want to complicate it, just look at the force, and you'll probably be 90%. You'll probably be good. All right, next week, who knows what we'll talk about? I certainly don't. You certainly don't. But it'll probably be something hopefully interesting. So we'll call it a day for here.